So, what is your overriding thought having heard that passage from Luke? Don't all shout it out at once.
Be prepared.
Don't you love it as a teacher when the class doesn't respond? Oh dear. Was it fear? No. Well, Jesus, how many of you ever worry? Mark, okay, me. Mary Lou, a few times. Al, you don't need to hold up Shirley's hands. And yet Jesus said in there, not to choose beforehand not to worry. These are challenging words from Jesus. Some of the harshest words he spoke. This past week, prior to Tuesday night, how many of you had made a prediction about how the American election would turn out? Did you? You tried? Were you right? You were right, you two. Same pew even. What about you? You were right? Wow. You were right? Oh my. I got a text on Tuesday night at 3:13 in the morning. I was up, and it's from our son in England. And he texted and said, I hope you guys, Emmy and I hope you guys don't mind if I try to stay in Europe given the electoral results. And I read that and I went, oh, Trump won? And so I searched on the internet on my phone and went, oh my goodness. And I texted him back, no, of course not, we understand. It'll give us some place to come and visit. As you know, there were a lot of predictions, official predictions. Not many of them said that Trump would win. Have you ever made predictions apart from elections? Predictions that came true or that failed? Yeah. Well, you know, in the history of people, there's always going to be predictions. And I'm going to give you a few big ones and funny ones. Funny, not ha-ha funny, but funny, wow, really? In 1943, Thomas Watson, chairman of IBM, predicted, quote, I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers. That's a picture of a computer from 1950. It says IBM on it in several places. Popular Mechanics magazine. I used to love reading that magazine. In 1949, I didn't read that one. In 1949, it made this prediction, quote, where a calculator is equipped with 18,000 vacuum tubes and weighs 30 tons, wow, computers in the future might only have 1,000 vacuum tubes and weigh only 1.5 tons. There's another, more recent popular IBM computer that certainly doesn't weigh 1.5 tons. There was an inventor by the name of Lee DeForest, and he claimed, quote, while theoretically and technically television might be feasible, commercially and financially it's impossible. How many of you have a TV in your house? How many have more than one TV in your house? How many of you have a TV in your house that does not operate with a remote control and you have to click the dial? You don't have those still? Oh. My brother we had this little kid's toddler's chair at home, and we had one TV in the house, in the basement. And we'd all sit downstairs and watch TV, and Doug would sit on this little chair in front of the TV, and he turned the channel so rapidly and so much that he broke out 3 tuners. My parents were not happy. So it's a good thing TVs have progressed the way they have. The Decca Recording Company made a big boo-boo mistake when they made this prediction, quote, we don't like their sound, and besides, guitar music is on the way out. That was their prediction in 1962 regarding the Beatles. Wow. How many other predictions have you read about, heard about, that have failed miserably? Including predictions about the end of the world. There was one, and I was here, 1999. There was a booklet that was produced, 99 Reasons Why the World Will End in 99. What year is it now? It kind of failed. On the Tuesday of what has been called Holy Week, Jesus, just days before his death, Jesus walks out of the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem with his disciples. And his disciples are admiring this beautiful structure, enormous structure. And one of them comments about the vastness and the beauty of the building, the grounds, the furnishings, the adornments, everything. It was spectacular. And Jesus pauses and looks back at all the buildings of the temple. And the big, there you go, the big one in the back, that's the Holy of Holy Places, where the high priest would go in once a year. So Jesus is looking at all the buildings, the walls of the temple, and he makes this prediction. To see these great buildings, not one stone will be left on another. Wow. To the disciples and all the faithful Jews of the day, that temple of the Lord in Jerusalem was their bedrock of their faith. The temple was the focal point of their life of faith in God. Nothing could bring down those walls. Look, teacher, they said, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Incredible it was, indeed. 3,000 years earlier, or 3,000 years before now, King Solomon of Israel built the first temple of the Lord for the Hebrew peoples to have a focal point for worshiping God. And it was spectacular. And it was destroyed after 400 years of use, destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And then roughly 50 years later, 538 BC, under the direction and the leadership of Zerubbabel, the remnant of Israel that came back to Jerusalem, they rebuilt a much smaller, scaled-down version of the temple, a focal point again. They finished it in 516 BC, and it was utilized by the Jews for worship until roughly 20 BC. And that's when King Herod decided he would destroy what was there in order to build a huge, magnificent new temple of the Lord. Not for the glory of God, but to pacify the Jewish peoples whom he was ruling on behalf of Rome. He made it massive, 500 meters by 300 meters. And in one place, he had to build a foundation wall to support it as well. In one place, the foundation wall was 400 feet tall. Huge structure. And he completed it in order to compete as well, the massive size, with the pagan temples that were all over the place. What's that one? The Parthenon, the temple to the Greek gods on the Acropolis in Athens. Part of one of the foundation walls remains today. It's called the Western Wailing Wall, where the Jews go and they stuff prayers in between the bricks. And they keep shoving them in the hopes that God will read and hear their prayers for their land and for their people and for the world. The ancient Jewish and Roman historian Josephus wrote about the massive size of this temple that King Herod built. He started it in AD 20 and he completed it in BC, 20 BC, and he completed it in AD 63. It took 83 years to build. By hand. They didn't have special cranes like we do today. They didn't have front-end loaders and great big diggers to help them out. Josephus writes that the smallest stones in the temple buildings weighed 2 to 3 tons. Many of them averaged about 50 tons. The largest one that still exists in the Wailing Wall is 12 meters long and 3 meters high, and it's estimated to weigh hundreds of tons. On the temple grounds, it was 45 acres of bedrock shaved flat, and estimated by Josephus that during Jesus' day, there could be as many as 250,000 Jews inside worshiping God, inside the temple area and the surrounding courtyard, all around it. So you can understand a little bit of the disciples' surprise and amazement and shock that Jesus would say, not one stone will be standing on each other of this temple. They walked down the Kidron Valley and up to the Mount of Olives. Peter, James, and Andrew and John wanted to hear more. They wanted more understanding of Jesus' prediction that a structure so immense would be leveled to the ground. It seemed highly impossible. They pressed Jesus for more information. They wanted to know when. They wanted to know what would be the sign that would take place before, so that they could know that this is going to happen. In their thinking, these disciples wanted to know when and what signs would precede the destruction of the temple, because they firmly believed that that would mean Jesus is now going to conquer the Roman Empire and re-establish Israel as the greatest nation in the world. And they, the disciples, would be like Jesus' top generals in the new kingdom. Perhaps in their voice was some fear about what Jesus was saying, because it sounds remarkably like the end of the world. Fear of the unknown, fear that their lives were about to change forever. Well, they were, and they did change forever, but not the way they thought. Jesus had made predictions before, but none like this. It was rather different. They couldn't quite understand it. And chapter 21 of Luke is an apocalyptic passage in which Jesus is talking about basically 4 different things. The prophecy of the destruction of the temple, and therefore the city of Jerusalem. Warnings against deceivers and false signs of the end. The return of Christ himself. And the need for all of God's people to be faithful and expectant in their daily living. 40 years after Jesus said this, his prediction came true. In 70 AD, the Roman general Titus crushed a Jewish rebellion, destroyed Jerusalem, and razed the temple to the ground. R-A-Z-E-D. Not one stone stood on top of another, except at the Wailing Western Wall. When did Herod finish the building of the temple? Here's your history lesson test. AD 63. When did Titus destroy it? AD 70. 7 years of worshiping the temple before it was gone. What can we learn from this prediction and its fulfillment? Well, we can learn something about the nature of bedrock faith. The kind of faith that you can build on. The kind of faith you can stand on. The kind of faith that enables us to live firmly and joyfully every day. How many of you like this church building? Very comfortable pews, is it not? One of the reasons why I'm up here and not sitting in the pew, because if I was sitting in the pew, I'd probably start nodding off. Because it's so comfortable and it's warm in here, and you know, when I'm sitting down. So my mother figured that I must have becoming the pastor because I could never sit still in the pews in church or on a chair, anywhere. You like this church. It's a nice building, right? You've seen other church buildings that are quite nice. We like them. Well, bedrock faith is not to be placed in temples or church buildings. But put yourself in first century Jerusalem. From anywhere in the city, you could see the temple of the Lord, high up on a hill. The center of their national life was there for over 1,000 years. In the temple, the Jews sacrificed, they confessed their sins, they gave their first fruits of the harvest to God, they sacrificed a lamb once a year on the Day of Atonement. It was there that Passover, Pentecost, the Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles, and Feast of Weeks were celebrated. With the temple so central in their life and their worship, this major question then arose from the disciples, basically. How would they possibly worship God without the temple? They didn't have an answer. We understandably get tied or connected to things. For a period of time, years, my mother complained to me whenever she talked to me about her church, my home church that I grew up in. Big cathedral type in London. And she complained not about the church, but about the people in the church. Not about the building, but the people. And most significantly for a while, and she knows I'm a pastor, she'd tell me all of her complaints about the pastor there. And I once asked her, well, what do you want me to do about it? I can't do anything about it. If you have a complaint, put it in writing, send it to presbytery, or send it to the session. You should forward it to presbytery, and they'll deal with it. That's the proper way of dealing with it. Well, she didn't want to do that, just continued to talk about it. And I said, well, if you're not happy there, why don't you leave and go to some other church where you're telling me all your friends are going and they're really happy there at that place? I won't name that church for you. And she said, oh, I can't leave. Well, why? Well, I love the church. Well, you've just been complaining about it. Well, I've been here since the 1950s. But it's just a building. Oh, it's more than a building. I mean, look at all the stained glass. That has beautiful stained glass windows in that church. She's so connected to the building that it's difficult. What would we do? What would you do if you came here on a Sunday morning and the building was gone? Could we still worship God? Yes. We might have to set up a few bonfires in a couple of weeks' time so that we keep a little bit warm. We wouldn't be using PowerPoint. We'd be playing guitars and not an electric piano. But if the building was gone, the disciples didn't understand what they were going to do without the temple of the Lord there. We get connected to buildings, to things as well. We even develop a sentimental attachment to them. But the temple was unique. You can almost understand and excuse the ancient Israelites for having such a close connection to the temple. After all, God himself is described in Deuteronomy in the Old Testament as being the architect of it, giving the exact dimensions, how to build it, and everything that's supposed to be a part of the temple. This really was God's building. And it's also the place where John's birth was announced, where Jesus' preeminence was recognized by Simeon and Anna. The place where Jesus' spiritual intelligence and wisdom was observed and commented upon when he was but 12 years old, and in the temple of the Lord, and noted by the religious leaders of the day. This is the place where the money changers were driven out by Jesus years later. It was here that the Apostle Paul was arrested. With the temple so central to the life and worship of the Hebrew peoples, how would they worship God without it? Neither great people nor great things deserve our worship. Only the one from whom those things come. Bedrock faith is not to be found in temples or any places of worship. No matter how old they might be, no matter how beautiful they might be. That one previous, go back a sec. That one is the temple of Hephaestus in Athens, the ancient Greek god of metal forging. In the 4th century AD, it became a Christian church. It is the best extant ancient temple that's now a church from the ancient world. The next one, Parthenon, in the city of Rome. The Pantheon, the temple to all gods. Pan, all, and theon is gods. The temple to all the gods in the ancient Roman Empire became a Christian church. Spectacular and beautiful inside. What's this church? St. Peter's Basilica. Not in Italy, in the country of the Vatican. beautiful, huge, almost the same size, a little bit bigger than the temple of the Lord, the ancient temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. And other churches, we get attached to the buildings. We're supposed to be attached to the bedrock of our faith, who created the church, not to be a building, but to be a people, a living, breathing entity, organism in the world. What will be the signs the disciple wanted to know that these things will happen, that the temple will be destroyed? Well, a preacher was talking recently for about an hour on TV about his new book, about the end of the world, and explaining very vociferously, you must have this book over and over again. And the telephone number is flashing across the bottom of the screen, and it wasn't even a toll-free number, so that you could order this book. And apparently he had some incredible prophetic insights into the events of the world and the politics and what was going to happen and how the end of the world was going to come. It was inferred in the presentation that we would not survive, the world will not survive unless we buy his book and read it. So one Christian phoned the number at her own expense and talked to the poor woman, the poor operator who answered the phone, and said to her that if this preacher really thought this book of his was so vital to the survival of people in the planet and that the end of the world was so near, don't you think he should be giving the book away? After all, if he's right and the world is about to end, what does he need a bank account for? What does he need money for? It's all coming to an end anyway. True, it cost him some money to print it up, but he won't have to pay for it if the world goes as he predicts it's going to go. There have been so many predictions over the centuries about the end of the world. But we are called to be on the preparation team and not the time and place team for the end of the world. It's one of the greatest of all the biblical mysteries. 23 out of 27 New Testament books claim that Jesus Christ will return one day. But we have no precise indication of when or where this will all occur. The problem with predicting the second coming of Christ is that most predictions seem to center upon world events. And there have been many peoples and groups over the centuries that have claimed to possess secret knowledge of when Jesus is coming and where we have to go to meet him and what we have to do in order to be part of that feud. The problem is, we're still here. The world is still here, and all of those predictions have not come to pass. World events are not the indicator of the end times. Wars and earthquakes and international political instability, famine, persecution, Jesus says, these are all signs of the end. They're facts of life as well. But then he said, when you hear about these things, don't be afraid. These things must happen first, but the end is still yet to come. They won't happen right away. All sorts of traumatic events on the world stage and in people's lives. And believe me, you know as well as I do that there's a lot of people in the world that think with the American election this past week that we're one step closer to the end of the world. As I tried to explain to my son, the world ain't going to burn anytime soon, don't worry. You'll be able to come home. Jesus described things in light of his second coming. I can't tell you when, but I can tell you why he's coming back. To redeem his creation, to set everything right, and to bring about a new heaven and a new earth of perpetual beauty and love and forever life, where there is no more evil, no more bad, just the perfection of God and his presence. If you don't live with the expectation that Jesus will one day return, then we miss the mark of one of his bedrock teachings in his life. The expectation that he is coming back, that he will set all things right. is huge. And it actually sets us free to enjoy life and live for the glory of God. It can help us to be watchful and prepared and at peace. No matter what's going on in our world, at peace because we know that God is in charge. That He is Lord of all the events and of all of our lives. At peace because with God in charge, He is going to unfold His future history as He sees fit. And He sees that it's going to be beautiful. And it will culminate in the return of Jesus. So the bedrock of our faith is not to be in the temple of the Lord. It's not to be in a beautiful church building. It's not even to be in people, in the church itself. The bedrock of our faith is where? Jesus. In Jesus. Mary Hollingsworth tells a story about the noted film director of biblical epic proportions, Cecil B. DeMille. When they began working on the movie Ben Hur, Cecil went and talked to Charlton Heston and convinced him that he should himself, instead of a stunt double, drive the 4-horse-width chariot in the final scene of the movie, in the chariot race. So Charlton Heston agreed, and he took chariot lessons. And he learned how to drive the team of 4 horses pulling his chariot. And when he learned, he went back to DeMille and he said to him, "I think I can drive the chariot all right, Cecil, but I'm not sure at all that I can actually win the race." And Cecil grinned and said, "Heston, you just stay in the race and I'll make sure you win." That's what God is saying in this passage. Don't worry. Your life might be tumultuous. Everything around us might be falling apart, and it can feel like that. But don't worry about the events in your life, because I'm in charge. God speaking. And especially when it looks and feels like it's the end of the world, which it isn't yet. And when it feels like that, God has everything under control. Everything to do with your life and mine, the life of His church, and the life of His creation. Everything under His control. And God is looking after the end as well. So all we need to do is focus on Jesus. And the peace that comes from that focus, from Jesus Himself, is immense. Greater than any temple or building structure where any of God's people could gather to worship Him. He's even looking after our southern neighbors after their election. God is amazing. Christ will return. And we will stand not on the bedrock of some church building or a temple, but we will stand on the bedrock of Jesus Christ Himself. Until then, remember, we're called to be on the preparation team, to be prepared and watchful for the Lord, for His return, and called to be faithful to God alone, seeking to share with people the confident hope and immense peace of life in the Savior, who is Jesus Christ.